Good evening. My name is Tom Byrne, and I'm the president of the Korea Society. Tonight we have a double header. First, we have a conversation with Seth Berkman. He is the author of A Team of Their Own, which tells the dramatic story of the joint Korean women's ice hockey team that participated in the 2018 PyeongChang Olympics. Following a book signing and reception, we have an 8 p.m. concert by the Korean Traditional Music Orchestra of the Blind. So we hope you can stay for that as well. We all watched in 2018 when South Korea, well, I think most of us did, hopefully, maybe we all here, watched in 2018 when South Korea hosted the PyeongChang Winter Olympics, and simultaneously relations between South and North Korea began to warm, setting up the denuclearization dialogue that is still underway today. I think one of the more visible and dramatic manifestations of that rapprochement was the female ice hockey players from North Korea who formed a united team with the South Korean athletes. I would have to say that the other visible manifestation was the contingent of cheerleaders that came down from North Korea. I did see some of the hockey games at PyeongChang, but I got there too late to watch the Koreans because they were eliminated. I just saw the post-elimination games. So I'm happy to turn the proceedings over to Jonathan Corrado, the Society's policy director, who will set the scene for our program with Seth Berkman. Jonathan.
Thank you, Tom. We're really lucky to be joined here tonight by Seth Berkman. This is such a cool book, and it's such a cool story. I think that this book portrays a moment in time remarkable not only because of its outsized consequences in history, but also because its characters are so easily relatable and so deeply human. The story of these young women has all the drama and intrigue of a Hollywood movie told in the form of an intimate conversation with a good friend. It's a story about sports that's not really about sports. It's about an unlikely team of misfits, feeling the tug of destiny with the eyes of the world upon them. It's about gender, immigration, adoption, and communication across cultural barriers. It's my pleasure to welcome to the stage Mr. Seth Berkman, who is a New York Times regular contributor, has been since 2012. He's written for The New Yorker, ESPN, and Spin. Please help me welcome, with a warm round of applause, Mr. Seth Berkman. So Seth, thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
First things first, why this story? What attracted you?
So the way I was introduced to the team, I was originally writing a story for the Times about basically how South Korea was building its first Olympic hockey team. So to go back a little bit, in 2011, South Korea was awarded the 2018 Winter Olympics, and celebrating, very happy about that moment. And then I guess it kind of just dawned on the Korean Olympic Committee, we have to send a hockey team to the Olympics. Even right now, in terms of women's hockey, there's only about 200 registered players in South Korea, so it's not a very popular sport. But hockey is one of the centerpiece events of the Olympic Games, and so South Korea needed to field a team. What had happened after basically realizing that there weren't many women's hockey players at home, a staff member of the Korea Ice Hockey Association, which I'll refer to as KIHA from now on, just for shortness. KIHA is the governing body of hockey in Korea, similar to USA Hockey here. And so a staff member at KIHA goes on Google or Naver and searches for American colleges and Canadian colleges that have women's hockey teams. He pulls up the rosters and starts looking for any names that sound Korean, perhaps. If they have photographs, if they happen to look Korean, he jots down their names and starts contacting these players. Eventually, he told me, even I interviewed him later on, the first couple were a Yang and a Wu, and no one responded to him. I actually spoke to one of the players, Chinese players he contacted, and she said, yeah, I didn't even know I got that email. She just ignored it. And actually, some of the South Koreans who first received these emails in the same kind of way had that reaction. They ignored it, or they thought it was spam, or they were being pranked. And so a lot of them didn't reply back initially, but I guess it is kind of weird to get a Facebook message or an email saying, would you like to compete for Korea in the 2018 Olympics? And so it took some time for them to realize this was an actual genuine offer, but over time there were eventually 6 Korean Canadians, Korean American players who became known as the import players, 6 imports who joined the national team. And so when I was assigned to write the story, it was going to focus on the import players. And so every few months, the team would fly over to Minnesota most of the time and set up a training camp where they would play against local high schools or colleges in the area, just because, again, there was no one to play against in South Korea. There were no other women's hockey teams. So they would come and play Minnesota, Wisconsin, schools like that. And that's how they were training for the Olympic Games.
So the idea was, let's bring over these import players to increase the competitiveness of the team.
Right.
That had to have an impact on the dynamic of this team as the import players were integrated in. Can you tell us a little bit about that integration process?
Yeah, I mean, on the surface level, it is a very sound idea, but both sides, the South Korean nationals and the import players, weren't too sure about this. A lot of the import players did have apprehension and worry. There were feelings of, am I coming in and taking away a spot from a Korean girl who's much more deserving, they felt like. They also didn't know how they would be accepted. Among the imports, you had Korean American adoptees, you had young women who were half white, half Korean. None of them really spoke the language or had a strong sense of Korean identity before joining the team. So there was a big fear of, how will I be accepted on the team in the locker room? And then on the Korean side, there was this, I don't know if you'd call it anger, but there was, or jealousy is too strong a word too, but are these import players going to come in and take our spots eventually? They knew that players in Canada and the US were much more skilled and highly better players, and so they feared, if they find a lot of these import players, are they going to take our spots on the team? So initially there was a lot of worry from both sides about how this was going to play out.
There's a buzzword in the book. Maybe some of the people in the audience will know the word babo. What does the word babo mean, and why is it important for this story?
At least in terms of the team, it was used in a much more genuine or friendlier kind of way. But basically, for those of you who don't know, it means fool or blockhead, something like that. And so when the Korean nationals first met the imports, they saw them not speaking the language, not knowing how to get around Seoul, and so they started calling them Babo. And it was something that the imports kind of embraced over time, so it became like a term of endearment. And so aside from being called the imports, they also used Babo a lot, interchanging it.
One thing that's evident from the story is that it's not easy to be a female ice hockey player in South Korea. There's a lot of hurdles, there's a lot of pain, and it's a tiny, tiny little community. Can you describe the process of what it's like? And especially once you get to this elite level, you're getting on in age, and it's not like you could play in a semi-professional team because there's one now, right? But was none previously. So how did they get by? What's it like?
Just about every player on the team played through injuries, torn ligaments, sprained ankles. These were injuries that would occur to them every few months, but they were committed to the national team. One player that kind of exemplifies this is the goaltender, Shin Jung. And so Jung started skating with the national team when she was 9 years old. That both shows how good Jung was and how few women played hockey in South Korea. And so Jung would start games in net when she was 14, 15 years old. So you have to imagine playing more developed countries in hockey, and you have a teenager in goal for you. In Korea's early games, they would lose 29-0, 25-0. The shots on goal would be 109-1, maybe. And Jung took the brunt of this offensive attack. She told me that after all these games, she would have bruises all over her bodies. They used to give her pain-relieving injections because she was getting hit by the puck so many times in these games. And so the physical manifestation, I mean, it sounds torturous kind of in a way, but when it comes to the composition of the team, you did have this very dedicated core of players who loved ice hockey. And so a lot of them did join the team similarly when they were just teenagers, and so they had known each other by the time the Olympics come around for 10 years, half their lives basically. And one of the things that I learned that I really picked up on and thought was one of the more unique and interesting aspects of the team, they shared these there were different personalities, but there were these common bonds you could see among them that were very unique in terms of just Korean culture. About 25% of the team came from single parent households, which, if you don't know, the idea of single motherhood in South Korea is still very much looked down upon. And so these young women understood the travails that their parents had gone through in raising them. But on the team, they saw other people who could understand and relate to that same kind of upbringing. And so they had their own kind of circle within the hockey team as well of friends who shared just personal stories together that made the bonds even stronger.
Another interesting aspect of this team, and there's so many, and we'll get to the North Koreans in a second, but before we get there, I want to talk about the coach, Sarah Murray. Who is she? Where does she come from? And what was it like for her to be thrown into this mix?
Yeah, so one of the threads or themes that I picked up on immediately when trying to write this book was the sense of belonging that everyone was searching for, the players on the team, but also Coach Murray. Sarah is the daughter of former NHL coach, Andy Murray. He coached about 10 years between the St. Louis Blues and the Los Angeles Kings, I believe. And so Andy Murray also coached Canadian national teams. He's a very well-respected, well-regarded person in the hockey world. And Sarah had played college hockey. She played at one of the top prep schools in the nation. But for women's hockey players, even today, there's not much. There are professional leagues, but it's very hard to make a living for a women's hockey player right now. And so by the time Sarah graduated college, she knew that she wasn't going to make the Canadian national team and that there was no real path for her to continue playing hockey. So she went and played in Switzerland for a few years and then went to China to teach English. But she still had this desire to still be embedded in the game. And one summer when she came back home, she's out training a little bit. Her dad at this time now coaches college hockey at Western Michigan. And it ends up that summer, her dad goes to a wedding of a former hockey colleague, and he runs into Jim Paik there. And so Jim Paik was the first Korean player in the NHL. And after Jim Paik retired, he became a coach himself. So he's coaching a high-level minor league team in the Midwest, and they get to know each other. And by this time, Jim has just taken over as the director of hockey in Korea. So he's the coach of the men's national team, who will also be playing in the Olympics. And he's also kind of in charge of the women's team. And his main duty at that time is finding a coach for the women's hockey team. And he mentions to Andy Murray that they do have an opening, and Andy's talking about where Sarah is in her life. And so Jim invites her for an interview. At this point, Sarah had never coached a team before. She didn't know what she was doing. She thought she maybe would go back to Switzerland and play, but knew there wasn't real longevity in that. And then so she goes and interviews for the head coaching job. And I think one of the things that really stuck out to Jim was she went in there and, said her goal was to win the gold medal. And I think she even knew a bit that she was just kind of boasting a little bit that was going to be very hard to nearly impossible. But he liked her determination. He knew that she was very strong. She had a very smart hockey mind. And the former coaches on the team were Koreans before that, and there was just not that kind of Western style of coaching that I think a lot of us associate with who have ever played any kind of sport here, where you do run into a more strict or drill sergeant kind of personality a lot, and the Korean coaches weren't that way, and Jim, having played here, I think recognized that and wanted a bit of a Western coaching influence.
So how did she communicate with the players? I'm assuming that not all of them spoke English.
Right.
So
There were maybe 2 to 3 players that spoke fluent English. So the composition of the team, also about half the team were teenagers. And the teens learn English in school. They study English, but they're really shy in speaking it. I encountered that right away. I would try to have these conversations, and I'd ask these really deep, detailed questions and just, yes, shake their head. So I learned that wasn't the route to go with them. But so they do learn English. They're just very shy in speaking it. Sarah, they gave her Korean lessons at first, but they also had a translator with her, which helped a lot. There was a team manager who spoke English as well, and then one or two of the players who were fluent on the team, they helped facilitate messages in practice. Luckily, before, when it came to actually hockey, that wasn't as hard because the South Koreans already used English words for some hockey terms, and they could understand when she would draw diagrams on, on the glass or on a whiteboard. But actually communicating was hard because Sarah didn't speak English.
Right.
I mean, Korean at all.
Right. And this is one of the more interesting elements, that a new language barrier was unexpectedly introduced when the North Koreans came to the team.
Yeah.
Because even though South and North Koreans both speak Korean, the dialects are so different that they had to come up with a little dictionary of terms.
So that was obviously the North Koreans joined 2-3 weeks before the Olympics. So there's so much you're thinking we're going to have to do in cram, and then immediately pops up this extra hurdle, which is when they get on the ice, the South Koreans realize that the North Koreans, I don't want to say don't speak the same language. They don't speak the same hockey language. For example, they'd be practicing, and if a North Korean player wanted a pass, instead of saying pass me the puck, she would say contact me in Korean. And so the South Korean players hear that. They don't know what she means when she's saying contact me. And so eventually the team manager and some other players who spoke Korean and English, they made these makeshift dictionaries that had the North Korean term for a word, the South Korean term, and the English term. So there was hope in some kind of way all these players could communicate together.
When it was first announced that North Koreans would indeed be joining this well-established team, which had been practicing together for years, and as you said, coming together as outsiders and feeling a really strong sense of community and identity through that team.
Mm-hmm.
How did they take the news?
The South Koreans were not very... I can only think of one player that was actually a bit happy with the news. It was this import player. Her name's Grace Lee, and she was like 17, 18 years old at the time, so she just had a very natural, happy demeanor, and she thought it was so cool that she was going to meet North Koreans. But other than that, all the other players were very angry. There were a few reasons why, one of them being they knew that the North Korean players at that time were not of equal skill level. There once was a time when North Korea was actually a bit of a power in Asia, and they would routinely beat with ease the South Koreans. But over the years, lack of funding and training and less of an importance focus on hockey in North Korea, and the team's performance started to suffer. And so in the later games that they would play, South Korea started to beat North Korea very easily. So they knew that they were adding players that were not of equal skill level and would really bring, the performance of the team down. Some South Korean players said to me, once they made this unified team, we knew we basically didn't have any chance of winning in the Olympics. So there was that aspect, but also the feeling of, it just being unfair. You have to remember that the South Koreans already accepted the imports, and that took time for them to form bonds and friendships, and they were not too happy about that at first. And now they're going to have to accept interlopers once again, this time only 2 weeks before the Olympics, and this time from North Korea. The players, the South Koreans, did not have the most glowing reviews or opinions of North Korea, and I think a lot of that is generational. They didn't have these strong attachments or new family members or friends from North Korea like their parents or their grandparents. They only knew of what they saw in the news and saw North Korea as, an agitator or a nuisance kind of in a way. There was also, when they would play North Korea at tournaments or events, the North Koreans were also very cold and chilly. Some South Korean players said that they would try to say hello or just talk to them in the cafeteria, and the North Koreans wouldn't respond in any kind of way to them. So there was all of that going on, and then also just none of them wanted to become seen as puppets, like political puppets in a way. Their whole goal of going to the Olympics was to proving that they belonged. They knew that they had received an automatic berth, but they wanted to show that at least we can compete with these other teams. And so when you threw in the whole geopolitical aspect, that bothered them a lot too.
One of the rather incredible stories in the book regards one of the athletes' grandparents' brother. I forget the exact relationship, but she had a very particular relation to North Korea. Can you tell us about that?
So the goaltender, Shin Jung, I had got to know Jung because she played in one of the professional leagues here in North America for a year. That's where I first met her. And then she also played college hockey in Canada for a few years. And so as I was reporting, I interviewed some of her teammates on the Canadian team. And they had told me this story about, they would ask Jung, what do you want to do after hockey? And she told them that she wanted to become an actress, which I thought was the most nonlinear kind of path for her. After hockey, I had never heard her talk about that before. And then one day I read an article, Korean English language website, and she had mentioned that she once had a relative who worked in the Korean film industry. So when I went to interview her for the last time after the Olympics in Seoul, I was going to ask her about that. And a few days before I met her, I don't know how it came about. I was just maybe looking on Wikipedia and went down a wormhole, but I was reading about Shin Sang-ok, who in the 1960s and 1970s was literally the most famous film director in South Korea. He married South Korea's most famous actress. He was like the Coppola or Scorsese of South Korea. And then later on in his career, Shin Sang-ok and his wife were abducted by Kim Jong-il. And so they were brought to North Korea. And so he lived under abduction for 7 or 8 years. And then they went to a film festival in Vienna and they were able to escape. And so his surname being Shin, and then Shin Jung, I was just going to make a joke about it to her, like, oh, I read that you have a family member who worked in the film industry. Is it Shin Sang-ok? Ha ha ha. And when I asked her, she said yes, and she told me the story about how her grandmother, I believe it's her grandmother's brother, was Shin Sang-ok. And so that floored me on several levels, but one of them being, I could only imagine what it felt like for her then when the North Koreans get added to the team, when she never met Shin Sang-ok. He died before. He lived a lot of his after they fled. He lived in Hollywood for a while, but she never met him. But she would hear stories about who he was and how he was abducted. And so for her, having a family member abducted by North Koreans and then being a part of this, political project where she's going to have to become teammates with North Koreans, that obviously unsettled her in certain kind of ways.
So there's a lot separating this team. You've got the imports first from the US and Canada, and then you've got the imports from North Korea, and then you've got the South Korean athletes. There's communication barriers. There's some prejudice against the other players just because outsiders, right? So how did they find ways to bond with all these hurdles in the way? What were the little things that brought them together?
One of the first things in terms of just the import players was the South Koreans realized how good they were and how trained they were, and that they would help the team dynamic a lot. Over time, there was only one South Korean player cut from the team. So over time, that became less of a worry, but they saw how good they were and how they could help them. So that helped ease things as well. And one of the key things that I honed in on when I really got to know the team was they eventually had this give and take sort of between the imports and the South Koreans. And what I mean by that is the import players, as I had mentioned earlier, never really felt any kind of connection to Korea. They never felt Korean, I guess you could say, living here. There was one player, Randy Griffin, who was half Korean, and her mom is Korean, and they lived in North Carolina, and there was one Korean restaurant nearby that her mom always wanted to take them to. And then when she took her children there to the restaurant, her mom could hear the waitstaff talking about her children in Korean. And so she never took her back there again. And Randy always remembered that moment. So she never felt Korean here, she didn't know what to feel. But living in Korean and being around other Korean women and learning about Korean culture definitely heightened that sense of identity for them. And in return, the South Korean players, not only in terms of hockey, but started opening up to the import players on many different emotional levels. One player, for example, um, she had bouts of depression, but she never spoke about it with anyone on the team because it's a very taboo topic to talk about in Korea. She thought she would be made fun of or bullied, but with the imports, it was something that she could openly talk with, and they were used to talking with other people about. Some other players had questions. They were curious about sexuality, another topic that you would never really talk about in South Korea, but with the import players, it was like an open book. They would essentially have Q&A sessions sometimes where they would meet in their dorm room, and the South Koreans would just fire off all kinds of questions about how do you feel about this or that. And so there was that really made the team closer. And then when the North Koreans came on, that didn't seem as easy at first. Obviously, you had the South Koreans very angry about what was going on. One of the players, Ko Hae-in, she told me the story about how early on they're all at the National Training Facility, which is in Jincheon, and that's about an hour and a half outside of Seoul. So all the Olympic athletes are there right before the Olympics. And so Hae-in said that she knew whenever a North Korean player was going to come into a room, because an Olympic official would run in and turn off the TV because they didn't want the North Koreans consuming any kind of news or anything. And so you had these early conversations between them that were very canned, very rehearsed, it seemed. And the North Koreans would end every sentence with, "Oh, it's all thanks to the great leader." One day they're sitting at the cafeteria lunch table, and the North Koreans are talking about ice cream. And the South Koreans are like, "Okay, we'll talk about ice cream with you." And one North Korean player goes, "Oh, yes, in Pyongyang, we have ice cream shops that have 3 different flavors, thanks to the great leader." And one of the South Korean player in response says to herself, "Man, if we ever take her to Baskin-Robbins, she's going to defect right away." So you just didn't have any kind of genuine communication going on. But after time, one of the things that a lot of players picked up on was you have all the athletes at Jincheon. Everyone's told, not only the hockey players, but the skiers, the snowboarders, don't take photos of the North Koreans. Don't put videos on Instagram of them. But every time the North Koreans would enter a room with the South Koreans in the cafeteria in a public area, everyone would just whip out their phones and start recording. And the North Koreans would get very nervous. And the South Koreans didn't like that. They didn't like to see them treated essentially like animals in a zoo. And obviously, a lot of the South Korean players had experienced that kind of feeling where you're just looked at as less than.
Right.
And so some of them started to pick that up, but also the import players helped because they knew what it was like coming onto a team and interfering with the team dynamic. And so some of the imports, even though they couldn't speak Korean, were one of the first ones to try to make relations with the North Koreans. And one player, Marissa Brandt, who's a Korean-American adoptee from Minnesota, a very sweethearted, very kind girl. Marissa's one of the nicest people you ever meet. So she took on this North Korean player whose name was Unjang. And every morning, Unjang would run down and give her a hug. And Unjang doesn't speak English, Marissa doesn't speak Korean. But at some point during the day, Unjang would signal or communicate to Marissa that she wanted to see her cell phone. And by the way she would hold the phone, Marissa could tell she probably never held a cell phone before. She didn't know how to use it. But then Unjang would communicate to Marissa to show her album of photos in her phone. And so Marissa would bring that up. And then for 10 minutes or so, Unjang would just be in a trance, staring at photos of Marissa with her friends or her family. And Marissa always would wonder what she's thinking about in that moment. Is she thinking about what her life could be like if she lived Marissa's life, etc. So even though the language barrier still existed, over time you saw some very strong kind of relations developing between the North Koreans, the South Koreans, and the imports.
Incredible. I'm just going to ask one more, and then I'm going to turn it to you, the audience. So please have your questions ready, and we'll get microphones to you. My last question for you is, this is a hard one, but I think you're well positioned to answer this. In the end, when you look at this, did it transcend political theater? Is there something deeper here, more meaningful here than just a political theater?
Oh, I think so for sure. If you ask any of the South Korean players, and I did ask them all, I was like, "Do you think you played any role in what's happened over the past year and a half? Like, when you see Kim Jong Un and Donald Trump shaking hands in North Korea, do you feel any responsibility, or you led to that?" And none of them wanted to take credit for it. Over time, though, I think they started to maybe appreciate that they were a part of something bigger. They still don't want to be known as, these symbols of peace, or to say, yes, we were the spark that, restarted relations between North Korea and South Korea on the peninsula. But I do think a lot of people, not only Koreans, but around the world, saw a certain kind of symbolism or something that they projected being together. They didn't win any of their games in the Olympics. A lot of the games weren't close, but over time you did see images and videos and photos of them being one team, and they really did become one team together, and they transcended, you had players from the suburbs of North Carolina teammates with players from the mountains of North Korea, and they were able to become this one team together. And so when people ask me about the book, I once heard someone tell me that when you write a book, you should be able to explain it in one sentence. And that's been impossible for me. But the one thing that most people remember is the North Korean, South Korean unification. And so I bring that up as a point of reference. But to me, that's only part of the book. To me, the story is really about, identity and finding the sense of belonging and a family, this family that they created amongst all their different backgrounds. And just to kind of expound on that, I mentioned before there were some South Korean players very curious, asking questions about sexuality. And in South Korea, some of them just couldn't believe that people could identify as LGBT. They just didn't believe that it was possible. And these were very smart girls and very well-learned girls. A lot of them were the ones who spoke English as well. But they just didn't grasp that. It was just something that was not talked about there. And then 2 weeks ago, one of the import players, she wed her partner, and 3 of the Korean players came to the wedding. And so I thought that was really resonant, just how a few years ago they probably would have never even acknowledged, a ceremony like this happening. And then here they were, celebrating this moment with her. So.
Well, I think he answered the question. It's a tough one, but I knew he'd be the one to be able to do it. So I don't know if you remember this, Seth, but we met at a KJ Club, one of Robert DeJorak from Temple University's events. And we just striked up a conversation over sushi. I said, "Hi, I'm John." He said, "Hi, I'm Seth. What are you up to?" And he said, "I'm writing this book about the Korean hockey team." And I said, "That's great. I work at this place called the Korea Society. You should come and give a talk." Yeah. And that was over a year ago, and here we are today. And we're really lucky to have you. Very interesting. Learned a lot more than what was just in the book. But there's also things in the book that didn't come out of the conversation. So the books are for sale right here. So please feel free to go ahead and pick up a copy. And Seth will be on hand to sign some books as well. Yeah, so you can get your book signed tonight. We are always happy to have you as members. So if you're interested in a membership, please come talk to us in the back. We're happy to sign you up for one of those. We've got some feedback forms. If you could fill those out and put them in the back as well by the reception desk, we'd really appreciate that. You're all welcome to stay for the 8 p.m. performance by the Korean Traditional Orchestra of the Blind. We'll have a little bit of food here in just a minute, which will be in the kitchen. And thank you so much. Please help me to give one last warm round of applause to Seth Berkman.